In the vast heart of the Orion Empire, beneath domes of shimmering crystal and light, the Imperial Council convened. For over 10,000 years, their civilization had reigned supreme, rulers of 500 conquered species, architects of peace through fear. 12 council members sat in a grand circle, their robes glowing with threads of starlight, the air thick with the quiet hum of power. When Councillor Reed rose to speak, his voice trembled with urgency. "My lords, the humans, they've achieved faster than light travel, in just 3 centuries. His words echoed through the chamber, met not with awe but with laughter. Admiral Marcus wiped a tear from his eye, his blue skin creasing in amusement. "You want us to fear them? A species barely out of their cradle?" The others joined. In their laughter rolling like thunder across the hall, Reed's eyes darkened. "They adapt faster than any race we've ever encountered. They learn. They evolve." But his warnings were drowned in mockery. Marcus slammed his palm on the crystal table. "Enough. Grant me a fleet and I'll burn one of their colonies to ash. Let the galaxy remember its masters." The laughter faded as High Counselor Bennett rose, his golden robes reflecting the room's pale light. "Very well," he said coldly. "Destroy one colony. Remind the stars who rules them." Reed stood silent as the council approved the strike, his heart sinking. He knew what they did not: that humanity's fury, once provoked, would not be easily contained. Marcus led 3 destroyers through the black like jagged crowns of night, their engines a low, inevitable promise. Their course was simple, brutal: New Eden, Aurora, New Terra. Radios carried the clipped, ceremonial cadence of an empire that had not tasted fear for 10,000 years. And in the bridge lights, the crew watched the stars fall away, as if the galaxy itself bent to the will of the great. In a matter of hours, the worlds were unmade, habitats ripped from orbit, cities that had taken centuries to build crumpled like paper, oceans boiled into steam, and the sky on each planet went bright with the flash of unanswerable force. Millions died in the span of a single dread-starred morning. Voices that had sung and argued and laughed were gone, and the ruins would be islands of memory for the survivors, if there were any, to salvage from the ash. The Imperium's Yao broadcast wrapped the remaining systems in velvet and threat. "Submit or face extinction," it said, the words polished and absolute, every syllable a hammer strike meant to crush resistance before it could begin. For a moment the cosmos held its breath at the arrogance of a civilization certain of its permanence. Then Earth spoke, not with a fleet or with an ultimatum of its own, but with 5 words burned into the universal channels like a challenge and a promise. "Remember, prepare, unite, survive, revenge." Those words were not a manifesto so much as a vow passed from person to person, from commanders to civilians, from scientists hunched over failing reactors to farmers in ruined fields. And in their crisp cadence something ancient and human flickered and then grew. Memory of past survival, the iron discipline to prepare, the stubborn magic of unity, the grit to endure, and the slow, patient calculus of revenge. Across the battered planets that still held breath, humans who could not forget began to share what they had: designs, codes, engines, stories, and old rivalries between nations and ideologies cracked and fell away under the pressure of a shared enemy and a shared loss. On the fringes, other species watched and listened. Some who had suffered under imperial rule for millennia felt a buried recognition stir, an ember of sympathy for a race that could be so small and so fierce. Councillor Reed, who had begged caution and been mocked, felt a chill of vindication, and the laughter he had once met in the council hall sounded suddenly thin and brittle, even as the Admiralty celebrated victory. Marcus returned to honors and parades, but when he drank and stared at the stars, his triumph tasted of smoke and something heavier: the knowledge that slaughter breeds not submission, but a slow, gathering resolve. The Empire had demonstrated its power. Earth had issued its reply. In the space between threat and retaliation, a new story began to form. one written in the stubborn human verbs of building and bonding and planning. And somewhere in that terrible future, the first seeds of a counterforce took root. Quiet and hungry, waiting for the moment when remembrance would become action, Marcus led 3 Imperial destroyers through the void. Enormous vessels of polished obsidian and light, shaped like jagged crowns cutting across the black. Their engines burned with the cold fire of antimatter, leaving trails of blue ion mist that glowed faintly against the stars. In the command bridge of the Vigilant Star, Marcus stood tall, his ceremonial armor glinting under the illumination of control panels. His voice, sharp and proud, echoed through the comms. Target coordinates confirmed. By decree of the High Council, the human colonies of New Eden, Aurora, and New Terra will be erased. Around him, the officers of the Imperial fleet responded in perfect, rehearsed unison. The Empire's war machine was flawless, disciplined, ancient, certain. For 10,000 years, no one had dared to resist them. To crush a young, reckless species like humanity was, in Marcus's mind, not an act of war, but a lesson, a reminder of the natural order of things. The destroyers approached New Eden first, a world of silver oceans and sprawling cities glittering beneath twin suns. Marcus gave the order without hesitation. Energy lances fell from orbit, slicing through planetary shields like knives through silk. Towers disintegrated, seas turned to mist, and millions of lives vanished in bursts of white flame. The same fate awaited Aurora, its floating colonies shattered into debris fields that sparkled like dying stars. On New Terra, humanity's pride, a beacon of expansion and survival, was burned to dust before the dawn could rise. The destruction lasted mere hours, but its echoes spread through the galaxy like a scream. Where there had been laughter, families, songs, and hope, there was now only silence and ash. When the killing was done, the Imperial fleet broadcast its message to the remaining human systems and to every observing race: submit or face extinction. The words rippled across the interstellar networks, carried on every frequency, calm, formal, and absolute. It was not a threat, but a declaration of fact. Civilizations across the galaxy watched and bowed their heads, knowing what defiance had always cost. On Earth, though, the reaction was not submission, it was fury. The human homeworld had known destruction before: floods, wars, famines, and self-inflicted ruin. But never like this, never from beyond the stars. The silence that followed the broadcast was brief. Then, in a single transmission, humanity answered. 5 words appeared on every Imperial monitor, every listening post, every fleet channel: remember, prepare, unite, survive, revenge. Those 5 words spread like a pulse through the wounded human colonies. Survivors dug through the wreckage, pulling children from the dust and whispering the words like a prayer. Soldiers wrote them into the dirt with trembling hands. Engineers engraved them on starship hulls as they repaired what remained. Remember, for the lost, for the burned worlds, for the arrogance that thought humans would break. Prepare, because they knew this war would not be won by rage alone. Unite. For the first time in centuries, nations and corporations and rival ideologies dissolved beneath the same purpose: survive, to endure, rebuild, and grow stronger. And finally, revenge. Not blind vengeance, but cold, deliberate justice, forged in silence and patience. In the shadows of the outer colonies, hidden research stations began to awaken. Projects once dismissed as impossible were revived. Experimental AI, quantum drives, living weapons. Scientists who had once competed for prestige now shared every secret freely. The humans became something the Empire had never faced before: one people, driven by memory and necessity. Across the Empire, whispers began to spread. Among the conquered races, those broken by millennia of Imperial rule, something stirred. The humans' message reached them too. Slaves and servants, smugglers and outcasts began to ask themselves what would happen if the Empire's wrath no longer inspired fear, but defiance. Counselor Reed watched it unfold with grim satisfaction. He had stood in that grand council hall, warning his peers that humanity was different, relentless, creative, and unpredictable. Now, as reports of rebellion and sabotage began to appear on Imperial outposts, he understood that the spark had been lit. The laughter that had filled the chamber weeks ago was gone. In its place, whispers of unease crept through the noble courts. Admiral Marcus returned home to parades and honors, hailed as a savior of imperial supremacy. Yet in the quiet of his quarters, when he looked out at the stars, he could not escape the faint echo of those 5 human words. Remember, prepare, unite, survive, revenge. They followed him like ghosts. In time, even the stars seemed to grow heavier beneath the shadow of what had been unleashed. The Empire had shown its strength, but in doing so it had awakened something far more dangerous: the indomitable will of a species that refused to bow. Across scorched planets, in underground bunkers and broken starships, humanity began to rebuild. They forged alliances, invented weapons beyond imperial imagination, and whispered to one another across the void. They would not attack soon, not yet. They would wait, learn, and grow, and when the time came, when their engines burned bright again and their fleets rose from the ashes, the Empire would learn what it meant to make an enemy of humanity. The stars would remember and the galaxy would tremble, not at the power of the old Empire, but at the wrath of those who had survived it. They came like ghosts, not one fleet but a dozen small, black needles slipping through the arteries of space, each pilot breathing quiet and absolute focus as they crossed the Imperial borders. 15 systems, 15 suns, and in the dark between them the human ships folded themselves down into signatures so thin, Imperial sensors passed them like empty space. On board the stealthers, crews moved with the calm of people who had rehearsed catastrophe until it felt routine. Engineers wrapped in cables feeding the phase shift capacitors, gun crews checking the alignments of weapons that did not merely blow things apart, but unmade them at the molecular level. Communication officers stifling the urge to speak and instead tapping the rhythm of the strike code into encrypted beacons. Targets were selected not for glory but for function. Command nodes, relay towers, shipyards, station dock clamps, the pylons that turned raw ore into a war machine. And when the human captains breathed the single coordinated signal, the dark turned into a suddenly bright and terrible choreography. At first the Empire thought it a probing raid, a skirmish to be punished later. A perimeter cruiser reported a faint ripple and then, impossibly, silence. Then, one by one, entire battle stations winked out as if someone had pinched the stars. Hangars collapsed transverse to their beams. Fleets vanished while their comm logs recorded nothing but a clean, impossible cessation of matter. Phase shift cannons did not fracture hulls or melt armor. They moved target states a hair off the axis of existence, sliding crew and alloy into a nowhere that left no wreckage to tell the tale. On orbital feeds, the scenes were obscene in their cleanliness. Empty space where a dreadnought seconds before had filled the viewport, a crater of light where a fortress had been. In system after system, human stealth wings dove in, took their shots with cold, clinical efficiency, and withdrew before the alarm could fully bloom. Where the Empire expected smoke and screams, there was only abrupt absence and the cold whisper of tactical data, updating to report. Target erased. Imperial countermeasures scrambled like nervous predators. Long-range arrays burned through their reserves trying to pin down the attackers' signatures. Sensor nets expanded and contracted like a living thing straining to find a pulse. Fleets that had ruled entire quadrants turned their bows toward the intrusions and fired everything in their magazines, only to find the black needles already gone, their volleys punching nothing but empty dark. It took hours for the truth to register in the logs. 15 systems crippled and still no coherent trace of the assailants. Command channels filled with stunned officers yelling numbers that could not be right. The council chambers flooded with emergency transmissions from governors whose starports had been removed from the map. Communication relays that once threaded the Empire together were gone. Supply chains ruptured. Raw material flows stopped in mid-transfer. In the space of a single day, the military's choreography, decks of ships, shuttle rotas, munition lines, unraveled into static. Across the human lines, the mood was not triumph but an almost surgical satisfaction. This was not the bloodlust of frontier raiders but the work of engineers and teachers and scavengers who had been denied safety so long they had become meticulous in their revenge. Resistance cells that had hidden on fringe worlds were now coordinators of logistic miracles. A rusted freighter would ferry a capacitor bank to a hidden yard. A retired physicist would recalibrate the phase oscillators. A child with nimble fingers would hotwire a relay. They struck bureaucratic knots, moral centers. The hydraulic heart of an empire used to being unchallenged. Civilian broadcasters in human systems did not shout victory. They read the lists of erased installations and then simply cataloged survivors and resources. The message passing between them was pragmatic and cold. Repair what remains. Harvest what the enemy left exposed. Hide what cannot be defended. Within Imperial command, the effect was seismic. Noble houses that had never known humiliation now squinted at maps and found them laced with holes. Festivities were canceled. Medals went unpolished. Marcus watched battle reports scroll past like a nightmare written in coordinates. He felt the old certainty that a single ordered blow could bend the galaxy, crumble under a new arithmetic. He had not been taught to count. The human capacity for reinvention multiplied by a willingness to strike without warning. He had ordered annihilation once and had tasted triumph. Now he tasted ash. Reed, in his private archive, read transmissions of broken dockyards and felt a vindication that was bitter and small. He also felt the unease, the recognition that a species mocked for audacity had turned audacity into a weapon. By the time the second cycle of strikes began, Imperial doctrine had become reactive where it needed to be proactive. Admirals reconfigured sensor frequencies, tried to flood the net with decoy signatures, and pushed experimental counterphases into the field. But every adaptation the Empire forced was met by another human innovation, another trick of timing and physics that negated it. The dismantling was not poetic but efficient. Munitions stockpiles vaporized, engines crucial to faster-than-light maneuvers slipped into that same off-axis state and failed to return. Entire squadrons of cloned pilots were removed from the order of battle as if they had been erased from a ledger. In the end, it was not a single glorious battle, but a cascade of functional losses that hollowed out the military's capacity to fight. Dockyards could not launch replacements, repair yards vanished, and the thousands of supply convoys that fed. An Imperial war machine ceased to exist in a silence that required no trumpets. When the reports ended and the dust, what little dust remained in systems now bereft of certain structures, settled into a new, colder order, Marcus stood alone on the observation deck of the Vigilant Star, staring at constellations that no longer looked like the comfortable grid of his childhood. He felt a weight beyond defeat, something like the recognition of a new predator or the realization that a trusted tool had become a living thing. The word that left him was not triumphant, but admitted. We've created something unstoppable. It was not a boast, but an obituary for the old balance of power. In his chest, it sounded like a knell. Around the galaxy, those words migrated through intercepted channels and frightened nobles and cautious slaves, and they became an accusation and a prophecy. The Empire had taught a young species to be lethal by trying to make it meek, and now that lesson had been mastered and amplified. Humans did not parade their victory. They continued to move in the dark, to perfect, to hide. Their ships were ghosts that had proven capable not merely of killing, but of dissolving the scaffolding of domination itself. And in the quiet that follows the first turn of any thunderstorm, both hunter and hunted knew the war had changed, not by degrees but by definition. The Empire had lost the assumption of permanence, and humanity had gained in one clean, terrible set of strikes, the terrifying truth that sometimes the smallest innovations, deployed without warning across a dozen small worlds, could topple an edifice that felt eternal. The fall of the Empire did not come as a crash but as a slow rolling silence, a chain of dying suns where order once reigned. One by one, Imperial worlds fell, not to invasion, but to the quiet precision of a new kind of war. The human fleets, once whispered of as myth and terror, now appeared in full view, thousands strong, sleek and silver, each vessel humming with the layered resonance of phase-shift cores. They moved not like machines but like thoughts, their formations bending and reforming faster than Imperial sensors could track. Where the Empire's dreadnoughts lumbered through space on predictable routes, humanity's ships flickered, vanished, and reappeared behind their targets. They were faster, smarter, evolved. the culmination of a century of vengeance sharpened into art. At the heart of this armada stood Earth's vengeance, the largest warship humanity had ever constructed, a monument of steel and purpose that stretched nearly the length of a small moon. Its armor gleamed like obsidian under starlight, and at its core pulsed a living engine of quantum light, a heart designed not merely for war, but for endurance. On its bridge, Admiral Lisa West stood in her black command uniform, her gaze fixed on the holographic sprawl of the Empire's heart worlds ahead. Her voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the noise of 1,000 channels as she opened a broadcast to the entire galaxy. "You taught us fear," she said. Her tone carried no rage, no venom, only truth. "Now we'll teach you strength." The message spread like wildfire, echoing in the halls of broken palaces, on shattered stations, in the minds of those who had once believed humanity weak. When the Empire's response came, it was desperate and vast, a counterstrike of unimaginable scale. Thousands of plasma batteries, dark matter cannons, and solar lances ignited in a synchronized wave, turning the void into a sea of burning light. But the beams passed harmlessly through the human ships as if they were ghosts. The phase field envelopes shimmered for a heartbeat, bending energy and matter alike, and the firestorm dissolved into silence. The Imperial admirals shouted for recalibration, for new targeting solutions, but there were none. Every sensor, every algorithm, every instinct failed them. Humanity had transcended the battlefield that the Empire still worshipped. Then, with the calm inevitability of the tide, the human fleet struck, not with wild fury but with perfect precision. Each shot found its mark: command stations, orbital shipyards, armories, fleet docks. Every structure that fed the Empire's war machine was unmade with surgical grace. Yet not a single civilian habitat was touched. On every world, human targeting systems bypassed cities, avoided life signs, even altered trajectories mid-flight to spare those who had no part in the war. The destruction was terrifying not because of its brutality, but because of its restraint. It was a demonstration of mastery, a new kind of power defined not by domination, but by control. As the campaign continued, the impossible began to happen. Imperial civilians, long conditioned to see humanity as savage and dangerous, began to defect. They shut down military outposts from within. They sabotaged command signals. On occupied worlds, people opened their cities' gates and raised signals of surrender before human ships even arrived. Word spread quickly. The humans spared all who laid down arms. They provided food, medicine, and order where the Empire had once ruled through fear. For the first time in 10,000 years, the galaxy began to trust a conqueror. Across the shattered remains of the Imperial core, Admiral Marcus, now a shadow of the proud man he had been, watched the feet of Earth's vengeance gliding silently over the capital world. No bombardment came, no threat, just a single transmission repeating across every open channel: "The age of fear is over." As Lisa West's fleet moved on, leaving the planet untouched, Marcus finally understood the truth that had eluded the Empire since the beginning, that humanity had not come to rule but to redefine what power meant. From the outer colonies to the Imperial throne world, people stepped from the ruins and looked upward as the human ships passed, dark wings against the stars. The old Empire, the monument to millennia of control, was gone, dissolved not by annihilation, but by transformation. Humanity had learned fear and mastered it, had turned pain into precision, and had chosen not vengeance through slaughter, but vengeance through mercy. And in that mercy, in that impossible restraint, the galaxy saw the birth of something greater than empire. The beginning of a civilization strong enough to spare even its enemies. The Imperial Palace fell not in fire, but in silence. The banners that had hung for 10,000 years, woven from the histories of 1,000 conquered worlds, drifted to the marble floor like autumn leaves, their colors dim beneath the smoke of a dying age. Once the beating heart of an empire that had spanned half the galaxy, the palace now stood hollow and broken, its towers scorched, its golden spires cracked. In the grand audience chamber, where laughter and arrogance had once ruled, the surviving imperial leaders waited. Robes torn, crowns cast aside, they knelt before the human delegation, expecting judgment, fearing the inevitable end that history had always promised the defeated. Admiral Lisa West entered quietly, her steps echoing across the crystal floor. Behind her walked no soldiers, no guards, only the quiet hum of translators and recorders. She looked upon the once mighty council that had enslaved half the known races, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Then, the eldest of the Imperials, High Counselor Bennett, once the voice of unshakable authority, raised his eyes and whispered, "You've won. Do what conquerors do." The room held its breath. West's gaze was steady, her voice calm, but when she spoke, it carried through every hall of the ruined palace. "No," she said. "We are not you. We never will be." The words fell like a bell through the silence. The leaders, expecting death, instead saw something they could not comprehend: mercy. There were no executions, no parades of humiliation. The human flag was never raised above the imperial crest. Instead, West extended her hand to the very people who had once called her species inferior. "You built an empire on fear," she said. "We will build a future on understanding." And so began a new chapter, not of conquest, but of rebuilding. Across the Empire's shattered worlds, human aid ships descended like silver birds, bringing not weapons but hope. Medical teams treated the wounded of every species, Imperial and Rebel alike. Engineers repaired life support systems, restored power grids, and cleared the ruins of cities once thought lost. Scientists shared cures, cleaned polluted oceans, and opened communication lines long cut by war. What had been the Iron Empire became something new: the Galactic Council, a gathering of voices where every species held a seat, and every voice a vote. Humanity did not rule it, they guided it carefully, as mentors who understood both power and restraint. The technology that had once destroyed fleets was now repurposed for peace. Phase shift drives to deliver supplies faster than light, quantum reactors to power entire worlds without harm, nanoforges to rebuild cities from dust. Worlds once scarred by war began to bloom again. On the former imperial capital, children of every race played in the palace gardens, the same gardens once forbidden to anyone without noble blood. Admiral West stood one last time upon the palace balcony, watching ships rise and descend like fireflies in the dusk. Around her, representatives of dozens of species spoke and laughed together. Humanity had not conquered, and they had healed. "We were forged in fear," she said softly, looking toward the stars. "But we chose strength through compassion, and in the vastness of the reformed galaxy, that choice echoed louder than any victory. The promise that from the ashes of tyranny a new dawn could rise, not ruled by one, but shared by all. The wind that swept across the plains of New Eden carried no ash now, only the quiet hum of renewal. Where once oceans had boiled and cities had turned to glass, the land had been reborn. Green stretched across the horizon, seeded by patient hands and the promise of forgiveness. At the center of this rebirth stood the memorial of unity, a vast circle of obsidian and crystal that shimmered under the pale sun. It was unlike any monument humanity had ever built. There were no statues of generals, no symbols of conquest. Instead, it bore the names of every world lost, every life extinguished, human and alien alike. Lines of light etched across the surface pulsed faintly, each one a memory, each glow a heartbeat restored to history. On the day of its dedication, thousands gathered, survivors, soldiers, scientists, and citizens from across the newly formed Galactic Council. Ships hung motionless above the skies, their lights forming constellations that would remain for the duration of the ceremony. The air was filled with the quiet reverence of shared memory. At the front of the gathering stood Admiral Lisa West, dressed not in uniform but in plain white, a color of peace, of closing circles. Her hair had turned silver since the war, her face marked by the gravity of leadership and loss, yet her eyes held that same steady calm that had carried humanity through its darkest hours. As she approached the memorial, a silence fell that stretched from the crowd to the orbiting ships above. Her hand rested on the stone, warm now from the light of the sun, yet heavy with remembrance. "When I first stood here," she began, her voice carrying across the field and through the broadcast relays that linked 1,000 worlds, This was not a place of peace. It was a graveyard. I saw skies that burned, oceans that screamed, and the end of everything we thought we were. She paused, letting the words settle. Around her, the wind stirred the banners of every known species, once divided, now woven together in one emblem of unity. But we remembered, she continued softly. We prepared. We united. We survived. And in doing so, we found something stronger than vengeance. We found purpose. Her gaze lifted toward the horizon, where the remains of a city's foundations still peeked through the soil, preserved deliberately as a reminder of the past. The Empire taught us fear, she said, her tone neither angry nor triumphant, but reflective and almost gentle. We answered with unity. Those 6 words echoed through the open air, through the relay channels, through the hearts of every being who had lived through the war. It was not a declaration of victory, but a vow fulfilled. The final line of a story that had begun in fire and ended in light. As the ceremony continued, lights flickered to life across the memorial's surface, each one corresponding to a fallen world. They shimmered brighter and brighter, until the monument resembled a living map of the galaxy. Each spark connected by threads of light, the network of lives intertwined, no longer bound by hierarchy but by shared survival. Around it, representatives of every species stepped forward in silence, placing offerings, a shard of crystal from a rebuilt imperial world, a vial of soil from Earth, a petal from the gardens of Aurora reborn. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say that had not already been written in their shared endurance. When the sun began to sink, West looked one last time at the gathered crowd. Let this memorial remind us, she said quietly, that even when we were broken, we chose to stand together. We faced the darkness, not as conquerors, but as one people. With that, she stepped back, allowing the memorial's central beam to ignite, a column of golden light that shot into the heavens, visible even from orbit. It marked not the end of a war, but the beginning of an era defined by unity, empathy, and peace. Later that night, as stars blanketed the sky, West stood alone before the glowing monument. The reflection of the light shimmered in her eyes as she whispered to no one in particular, "May we never forget what fear tried to make of us, and what we chose to become instead." The breeze answered softly, carrying her words across the fields of New Eden, over the quiet hum of ships and the rustle of grass until it faded into the vast, waiting silence of the galaxy. A silence that no longer felt empty but alive with hope.